My stepmother gave me the wrong time for my dad's retirement dinner to make me look bad, so I let him read her own trap. My stepmother gave me the wrong time for my dad's milestone retirement dinner, listing it as 8 p.m. instead of 5 p.m. so I would show up hours late. Her plan was to convince my dad that I simply didn't care enough to show up for him, framing me as an ungrateful daughter in front of the entire family. Instead of throwing a tantrum or confronting her early, I showed up ahead of schedule, set up a quiet observation post, and let my dad read her own trap at the dinner table. My name is Scarlett. I am 22 years old, and for the past 7 years, I have had to navigate the delicate, often hostile waters of a blended family. My biological mother passed away when I was a teenager, a loss that reshaped my entire world and left a profound bond between my father and me. For years, it was just the two of us, relying on each other as we rebuilt our lives. But 5 years ago, my father met and married Diane. Diane was elegant, charming in public, and highly focused on social standing. She also came into the marriage with a deep, unyielding resentment of the space I occupied in my father's heart. From the moment she moved into our family home, Diane set out to quietly draw a boundary line between my father and me. She never used overt hostility. Instead, she relied on a passive-aggressive strategy of omission. I would return home from university for the weekend, only to find out the family had gone out for a special dinner the night before, because Diane forgot to text me the details. Family portraits were rearranged so that older photos of my biological mother and me were placed in the dark corner of the hallway, replaced by bright staged photos of Diane and my father. I chose to handle these slights with maturity and silence. I worked hard, maintained an independent life at my university apartment, and focused entirely on the solid, unchanging relationship I shared with my father through our weekly Sunday morning phone calls. The conflict escalated dramatically when my father announced his upcoming retirement. After 35 years of dedicated service as a senior structural engineer for the county, he was finally stepping down. It was a massive personal and professional milestone for him, and he was incredibly proud. Diane immediately took total control of organizing the celebration gathering. She booked a private banquet room at a historic, high-end restaurant downtown and coordinated the invitations for his former colleagues, old friends, and the extended family. 2 weeks before the event, I visited the house to drop off a book my father had asked for. My father was out running errands, leaving Diane alone in the kitchen. She looked up from her planner, offering her standard, cool smile, and reached for a stack of heavy, custom-printed invitation cards on the counter. She pulled one out, took a fountain pen, and casually scribbled the details on the back before handing it to me. "Here is the official itinerary." "Scarlett," Diane said, her voice smooth and entirely indifferent, "I know you're busy with your final semester exams, but your father would be deeply hurt if you missed it. The dinner starts promptly at 8 p.m. Please make sure you aren't late. You know how structured your father is about timelines." I looked down at the physical card. In clear, distinct, elegant cursive, Diane had written, "Location, the Oak Room, 8 p.m. I thanked her, tucked the invitation into my handbag, and drove back to my apartment, fully intending to arrive early to support my dad. The trap began to unravel on Thursday night, just 24 hours before the retirement dinner. I received a casual phone call from my cousin, Mia, who was driving into the city for the gathering. During our conversation, Mia happened to mention how excited she was to try the restaurant's early evening tasting menu, since the seating was scheduled for 5 p.m. My heart dropped into my stomach. I asked her to repeat the time. Mia confirmed that the physical invitation she received in the mail explicitly stated the cocktail hour began at 5 p.m., with the main dinner service starting at 5:30 p.m. I hung up the phone and sat at my desk in absolute silence, the realization of Diane's malice washing over me. The plan was terrifyingly simple. If I followed the card Diane gave me, I would arrive at the restaurant at 7:45 p.m. By that time, the speeches would be completely finished, the dinner would be over, and the guests would be preparing to leave. Diane would have spent nearly 3 hours sighing, looking at the empty chair next to my father, and quietly painting me to the entire extended family as a cold, self-absorbed, ungrateful daughter who couldn't be bothered to show up on time for her own father's life milestone. My immediate instinct was to call my dad directly, tell him what Diane had done, and demand an explanation. But as I reached for my phone, I stopped myself. If I called now, Diane would claim it was a simple, innocent clerical error. She would say she made a mistake in her haste, cry, and twist the narrative to make me look confrontational right before my dad's big day. The doubt would remain in my father's mind. I didn't want a frantic phone call or an apology behind closed doors. I wanted absolute, undeniable exposure. I needed the truth to be revealed exactly when Diane believed her trap was closing. I spent the next morning preparing myself myself mentally for the confrontation. I dressed immaculately in a formal, respectful outfit, maintaining the absolute standard required for my father's celebration. I drove downtown and arrived at the restaurant at exactly 4:30 p.m., a full 30 minutes before the actual guest arrival time listed on my cousin's invitation. The restaurant was traditional and spacious, featuring heavy oak architecture and deep booths separated by high wooden privacy partitions. I walked into the main dining hall and located the private banquet area booked for my father. The tables were beautifully set, and the seating arrangements were already finalized. I noticed the place card with my name on it had been placed at the absolute far end of the secondary table, miles away from my father's central seat at the head of the room. Instead of taking my seat or making my presence known to the restaurant staff, I approached the floor manager at the front podium. I explained calmly that I was the guest of honor's daughter, but that I needed to complete some independent preparatory work before joining the main party. I asked to be seated in a specific private booth located directly adjacent to the banquet room entrance, a spot that was entirely hidden from the main tables by a thick structural pillar and a velvet curtain, but close enough to hear every word spoken at the head table. The manager, entirely unaware of the family politics, politely guided me to the booth. At 5:01 p.m., the guests began to stream into the room. Through the gap in the partition, I watched the arrival of my aunts, uncles, cousins, and my father's lifelong engineering colleagues. The room filled with warm laughter, the clinking of glasses, and celebratory chatter. At 5:15 p.m., my father walked in, looking incredibly distinguished in his suit, accompanied by Diane, who was radiant, smiling broadly, and greeting the guests with immense social grace. As the dinner service began and the first courses were served, I sat back in the shadow of the partition, completely silent, listening intently. It didn't take long for Diane to begin executing her strategy. Whenever a relative approached the head table to ask where I was, Diane would lower her voice, adopting a posture of deep performative sadness. "Oh, we're still waiting on Scarlett," I heard Diane say to my Aunt Eleanor, her voice carrying clearly through the wooden partition. I sent her the invitation weeks ago and even reminded her personally. But you know how university life is. I suppose her social calendar or her exams were just too demanding to prioritize her father tonight. It's heartbreaking, really, but we just have to carry on. I looked through the gap and saw my father's expression darken. He looked down at his plate, his shoulders tensing slightly. He didn't say anything, but the quiet hurt on his face was agonizing to watch. Diane reached over and patted his hand, explicitly reinforcing the idea that his only daughter had abandoned him on his most important night. By 6:30 p.m., the main dinner service was clearing, and the room grew quiet as Richard, my father's former business partner, stood up to deliver the primary retirement toast. He spoke beautifully about my father's dedication, his integrity, and his long career. Throughout the speech, Diane continued her performance, casting frequent, dramatic looks at the empty chair at the far end of the room, shaking her head subtly so that everyone at the head table could see her disappointment. When the toast concluded, my father stood up to thank the room. His voice was steady, but there was a distinct lack of joy in his delivery. He thanked his colleagues and his friends, but his eyes kept drifting toward the door, holding a faint, fading hope that I would walk through it. As he sat back down, Diane leaned in close to him, speaking loudly enough for the immediate family members at the table to hear. "It's truly a shame, dear," Diane whispered with a heavy sigh. "The dinner is practically over, and she didn't even bother to send a text. I think it's time we face the reality that Scarlett simply doesn't value this family milestone the way the rest of us do." That was the exact phrase I had been waiting for. The trap had closed completely, and Diane had spoken her definitive lie in front of the entire core family. I stood up from my hidden booth, slipped the physical invitation card out of my handbag, and walked out from behind the velvet partition into the bright light of the banquet hall. The room fell entirely silent as I walked down the central aisle between the tables. A few cousins gasped, and my Aunt Eleanor looked up in absolute shock. Diane's head snapped toward the entrance, the smug, satisfied expression on her face dissolving into absolute panic within a single second. She had calculated that I would arrive at 7:45 p.m. when the room was empty. Seeing me stand there at 6:45 p.m., entirely calm and immaculate, completely shattered her timeline. My father looked up, his eyes widening as he stood up from his chair. "Scarlett, you're here?" I thought. "Diane said you weren't coming." I walked directly to the head table, ignoring Diane completely, and stopped right next to my father's chair. I offered him a warm, relaxed smile and reached out to hug him tightly. "Happy retirement, Dad," I said, my voice clear, echoing through the silent banquet room. "I've actually been here since 4:30 p.m. waiting for the event to begin." My father stepped back, completely bewildered. "What do you mean you've been here since 4:30? Diane told the entire table that you skipped the dinner because you were too busy with university." Diane tried to scramble, her voice rising in a sharp, defensive pitch as she stood up and reached across the table, Scarlett, please don't make a scene at your father's celebration. There must have been a simple miscommunication. I wrote down the details in a hurry. I probably just made a mistake. There was no miscommunication, Diane, I said, turning my gaze directly onto her. I kept my voice entirely level and devoid of emotion. I placed the physical custom invitation card flat on the table directly in front of my father. Dad, look at the handwriting on the back of this card. My father picked up the card. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes locking onto the elegant, distinct cursive script. He read the line aloud, his voice dropping into a cold, dangerous register. Location: the Oak Room, 8:30 p.m. My father turned the card over, inspecting the official county print, then turned it back to look at the handwriting. There was no digital message to debate, no ambiguous text thread, and no phone log to dispute. It was Diane's personal fountain pen ink, written on a custom card that only she possessed, explicitly instructing his daughter to arrive 3 hours after the celebration had already started. The weight of the physical evidence crashed into the head table. My father looked from the card to Diane, his face turning a deep, furious crimson. The aunts and uncles at the table leaned in, recognizing Diane's handwriting instantly. The realization that Diane had deliberately attempted to sabotage a daughter's relationship with her father, purely to execute a petty social framing at a retirement milestone, was undeniable. "You wrote this?" my father said to Diane, his voice low but carrying a terrifying structural weight. "You explicitly gave my daughter the wrong time so she would miss my retirement." Diane opened her mouth to speak, her hands trembling as she looked around the table for support. But the relatives who had just been listening to her weep about my lack of respect were now staring at her with absolute disgust. She tried to say, "It was just a mistake. I thought the room was booked for 8. The banquet room contract was signed by both of us for 5 p.m. 3 months ago." "Diane," my father interrupted, cutting her off cold. "You knew exactly what time it started. You lied to me, you lied to my family, and you tried to humiliate my daughter on my celebration night." Diane realized the social exposure was absolute. She couldn't play the victim, and she couldn't spin her way out of her own written ink. Without another word, she grabbed her wrap shawl and her designer clutch from the back of the chair, turned on her heel, and walked swiftly out of the banquet hall, the heavy doors clicking shut behind her. The room remained tense for a moment, but as I took the seat right next to my father, the atmosphere completely cleared. My father pulled his chair close to mine, his eyes welling with tears as he thanked me for showing up, apologizing deeply for ever allowing Diane's words to create doubt in his mind. The rest of the evening turned into a genuine celebration. My relatives spent the night catching up with me, completely unified in their support, while Diane remained entirely isolated in the fallout of her own trap. Since that night, my father has took total control of our family gatherings, ensuring Diane is permanently removed from any communication regarding my life, leaving our bond stronger and entirely transparent.